This is with Karl Xavier he's the head of investments with Axilium Holding. He's going to talk about the Death Valley phase, which is a really interesting topic. So I'm super excited to hear. So come on up.
Thanks.
And take it away. And if questions come up, then I'll just note them down and we can take them. Yep.
Okay, sounds good. I work at Axilium Capital or Axilium Holding, an affiliated company. I'm one of the partners there, and I started this company together with another partner a couple of years ago, and really getting deep down into this startup investing scene, which was quite new to me up until a few years ago. Startup investing is a completely different type of investing. We have traditional investments with shares and property and fixed interest investments. Startups is off the chart. So, okay, we're good? Okay, sorry. Yeah, so it's really off the chart, and that's something that really caught my attention, because traditional investments, they've become a little bit boring, and something that even the wider general public is realizing is that's also the case. But unfortunately, we found my partner and I that retail investors, the normal mums and dads out there, they don't actually get access to these investments in the really good startup companies. And they're either too small, they don't have the contacts, they don't have their expertise, and that's something that we wanted to democratize then at Axilium. So what we've done, we've started a business model where Axilium Holding does investments, and we then package investments together and offer a collection of retail members that we have the opportunity to invest in those companies and become an indirect investor. So we represent them, they get the opportunity to be part of the exciting journey, but the startup company doesn't get a massive cap table that they need to worry about. And so far that's working out quite well, and we're having a lot of fun doing it. So our background is from financing, and I mean, I have most of my background is from financial advising to high net worth clients, and some of them got those opportunities, but I saw that they weren't really going to the normal people out there. So we focus on early stage technology companies and life science companies as well. That's something that I guess that's where the real innovation is, where you can make a paradigm shift and get that massive change in the market that we're looking for. It's right at the sort of end of the risk scale. As my colleagues mentioned here, the people behind the investments that we look at, they are absolutely the most important. Without them, without the right person behind it, we see that an idea won't fly. It doesn't really matter how good that idea is. We also look for true innovation, something that's globally scalable and really changes the market that it's in. So as Clementina said here, you can compare sort of different competitors and see what's out there, see what the customer is doing now. We're not looking for something that's incrementally better. We're looking for something that fundamentally changes what the customer can expect from your product. So here's a little collection of our portfolio companies. A couple more have been added since then. I might actually come back at the end of the presentation and do a case study on some of them, but there's a mixture there of life science companies, high-tech companies, Internet of Things, data analysis, virtual reality, biotech, medtech, and that's the sort of thing that we look at. So anyway, let's get into the actual presentation, the famous Valley of Death. It sounds macabre, and it is, I suppose. It comes a lot from the Silicon Valley, so not so much the historical valleys of death where people actually die, but in the valley where this is the home of the startups, the real traditional tech startups. It's not really a valley though, it's more like a mountain range. It's a journey that you start. You've gone through the stage that my colleagues talked about here. So you've gotten started, but then you're not quite there. You don't have a product that's proven commercially yet, and you need to get investors on board that actually believe in your product and to fund that high risk stage, achieving those milestones, getting to commercialization, and even beyond that in many cases. So it's really a case of going up, reaching milestones, then going down into the next, and then lifting yourself up again to get over the next mountain and continuing on. And for some that'll take years, and for some it'll be a shorter journey, depending on where you are and what you're doing. lack of liquidity is really what kills companies. It might have been a bad idea. There'll be any number of reasons, but at the end of the day, you run out of money. So that is really the key to survival, is to keep a very close eye on your finances. And also keep in mind that Death Valley, or this stage, it's part of a filtering process. So if you see it from a systematic point of view, we need to have this stage because there's way too many ideas out there. There's not enough investors, not enough money, there's not enough customers. So we need a way of filtering, and that's what this Death Valley phase does. So in a sort of a Darwinian way, we actually get rid of the weaker players, so only the strongest survive, and they're the ones that can go on then and serve customers at the end of the period. And unfortunately, though, it's some of the strong companies, some of the good ideas will actually also disappear, and that's because those people don't have the skills to actually sell their idea. So they might have a fantastic idea, but they can't sell it to investors. They can't explain the benefit to their customers, and then they will end up failing. So that's a point of warning, and we'll come back to that later in my presentation too. But it's making sure that you have the right people and the right competencies to cover all the bases that are required in this stage. It's really hard work, and it's not for everyone. As Helene said here, I mean, you need to be a little bit crazy actually. It's not the risk in the short term is so high, the reward is almost zero in the short term, because even though you make it through this stage, the rewards come much later. So so keep that in mind when you decide on doing this. When you start your company, then don't do it lightly. Make sure you're really committed and you really know what you're doing. Otherwise, you're wasting your time. And remember that there's a difference between then entrepreneur risk, the risk that you take, compared to the investor risk. So you're risking everything. You're risking, you could probably get an 8 to 5 job. A lot of the people that we're working on in our startups, they're on very low salaries. They could easily get a 6-figure salary at a multinational, but they chose this life. So they're taking a lot of risks there, and they're managing all the risks in the business, on the development side, on the sales side, everything that happens in the environment around them, corona strikes, whatever could happen. And the investor risk is a little bit different. They're a lot more objective. They look at the investment, they look at what's the potential return here, and they're looking for a big return. Remember that. They want something that can really fly, and they know the risk. It's almost binary for them, as in it would almost be a better outcome for them for the company to go bankrupt than to just plod along for 10, 20 years and nothing really happens. So they're in it for the risk, but they're expecting a high reward. And then these mountains that you're climbing up and down into the valley, and the next mountain, it's tough, it's hard work, but remember that these so-called risks, these are also your milestones. These are every time you manage to climb one of these mountains, you're achieving an important milestone on your journey to success. So it's not as perhaps negative as it sounds when you're looking at the word risk. It's actually creating value and making your business more and more viable, and every risk that you reduce increases the value of your company and the attractiveness towards investors. So how do we get around some of those risks or deal with them? Well, there's lots of tips we got earlier today in the presentation, but I would say have a very, very clear focus. I call it a laser focus. So delete everything else that's not important around you in your life, and also even in the company. Develop the right things at the right time. Anything that can wait, then wait with it. You don't have the time or the money, most likely, to waste your time. And that could be really good opportunities I'm talking about. You might be developing something for a particular industry, then you might get approached by a company from another industry which says, hey, couldn't you guys, you've got this great VR team, couldn't you do a VR application for us? Well, and they're willing to pay for you, but that'll take your focus off your main goal. So you have to decide, is that worth it or not? And I would say generally not. Usually when companies get distracted at that early stage, then they lose focus and then nothing ever happens of it. And at the best case scenario, they end up being a consultancy. So I would say maintain that focus as best you can. Bootstrapping is probably a term that you've heard. It's not necessarily eating 2-minute noodles and living in your mother's basement for 5 years, although that is the case. And there are many successful companies that I'm sure you know about that have gone through that. But it's keeping a distance to taking in external capital for as long as possible, making ends meet as best you can to really build that value on the company before you start giving away equity. To fail is to plan. To fail to plan is to plan to fail. And it's a saying that I tell myself and my companies a lot. It's very tempting when you have a good idea to just go out there and do it and get started. And I think we have a lot to learn from the universities there. I know myself, at university you learn to do things very methodically, the scientific method or equivalent. Then when you get out to a workplace, you find that nobody does that. Nobody really has time for that. They just go for it straight away and hope it flies. You can't really afford to do that with a startup. I think you should, if you do a proper plan, you can save so much time, so much money. You might even do a pivot before you've even started your journey. You might come to see that it wasn't a good idea, something that you had missed, but in your planning, you find that, and then you decide to do something else, saving yourself a lot of time, energy, and money. So really, I can't stress that enough. Have a plan, write it down. Doesn't mean the plans can't change, but have a plan. And there's so much free advice. There are so many people out there in your own network and your network's network that would be willing to help you. People like, not just Biner and universities and Almi, people from the industry, people who work in the industry. Look it up on LinkedIn, ring up the companies and visit them, have lunch with some of the people who've been working in this field for years and years, present your idea and get some feedback. Talk to a lawyer friend and ask about setting up the company. Get as much free advice as you can, and that's just not in the beginning. That goes for the whole life of the company. There are good risks and there are bad risks. There are these good risks, which are the milestones which you have to take. You have to decide on a lead candidate in your project, or you have to decide on a particular programming language, or whatever decisions you need to make. Those are very important choices, and you can't get around not making them, because otherwise you won't move forward. And every time you make one of those choices, you're taking a risk. But that's a good risk. But there are also some bad risks out there which are unnecessary. And I would call bad risks cutting corners unnecessarily, things that give you a short-term gain but then come back and bite you later. Perhaps employing suboptimal people. You get the wrong people in a small team, and that could be devastating. The way you present yourself, make sure your web page looks good. Make sure there aren't any errors in your presentations and your figures, because it's just so unnecessary, and it creates a negative image for your company from the start before they've even looked at your idea. And somewhere along the line, a lot of the products that we look at, or the services, they're so innovative, they're so new that it's hard for investors to grasp, which means that investors will use the quality of your presentation as a sort of indication of your own quality and how good are you at getting things done. So don't take those sorts of risks. Make sure you get your stuff in order. And last thing to get in order is your personal finances, because a lot of the time, all the effort goes into the company, and all of a sudden you find yourself deep in debt. You don't have housing, you don't have food on the table, and that's obviously going to affect your ability to grow your company, to attract investors, your own sanity. When you're working so hard, 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, you need to make sure that that's in order. That doesn't mean a life of luxury in any way, but it means making sure that you've thought about that, and that's part of your plan. So let's talk a little bit more about investors then. It's funny, we talked about this earlier, and I've talked about that a lot in my days as investing. It's a little bit like a marriage. When you invest in Volvo or Ericsson, it's just an investment. You can sell it. Whereas when you're meeting investors and you're going to invest money together and time together and spend a lot of time together, and at good times and bad times, you need to be able to trust that this partner will be able to stick through you, that you have the same vision, and that you're in agreement as to how you're going to run things, even when things go a little bit sour, which they will. There will be hard times. There's always going to be hard times. So choose your investor based on personality, making sure that you work well together, And also look at what fields they're working in. Without going out and sort of meeting everybody, think a little bit about what type of investment you want. What experience do you want them to have? What stage are you at? Is it better to get a couple of angel investors in that can really get hands-on and work with you? Or are you ready for the bigger VCs? Think about which VCs in that case. What fields do they specialize in? What geographical areas do they have their contacts? Because the money, they all give you the money. It's what they can give you aside from the money that's important too. So think about that. You need to be able to, you're kind of selling air, unfortunately. Volvo's not selling air, but you are, because you have a vision, you have a product that you want to develop or a service, and you think it's going to be great. You think it's the greatest thing since sliced bread. But the investors, they need to be able to buy that too. So you need to be able to sell this vision and really make them part of the vision, make them understand how big it can really be, and make it believable as well. Know the market like inside out. Clementina said that you think you have no competitors. Well, obviously you do. Everyone has competitors or alternatives. Yeah, you need to know who they are. You need to know where the trends are. How will digitization affect you? How will COVID affect it in the short term, or any other of those sorts of events? Shifts in politics, anything that's happening in the world today or in the future, how will that affect you? And what does the market look like? Is the market changing? Is it combining with another market? Is it a sector that's developing that doesn't exist today? Make sure you know that inside out. Your investor will test you on that. And you definitely don't want to be in a situation where you can't answer those questions, because that'll be a deal breaker straight away. Make sure you know all your numbers as well. So you've done your customer surveys, you've done some questionnaires, you've gone out and tested a product, you've looked at done data analytics on customer products. Make sure you're on top of all those numbers and have all those stats in your head, because that's another thing that the investors want to know, that you actually have studied these things. And be able to motivate all these assumptions that you've come to, because you're going to end up giving them forecasts for sales, market share. Have a really good story about how you got to those assumptions that's also believable for the investor. And then finally, it is once you've shortlisted these types of investors that you want to meet, then you just have to go out and do the work. It's actually strangely enough become easier in some ways now because of COVID, which has sped up the whole digitization. So you can actually have meetings, especially in other geographical locations. But you need to, the more investors you meet, the more chance that you'll meet the right one or the right ones. And it's hard. It's going to be a full-time job. And we see that it's almost heartbreaking in some cases with our entrepreneurs that they have so much to do in their company on the development side, the work that they're actually supposed to be doing, but then they have to put almost a full-time role in on top of that on meeting investors. But keep that in mind so you know that, so you go in prepared. And once you start getting the investors on board, then it can snowball. So don't lose hope. Even if you get no's after no's, keep going. And once you do start getting the yeses, then think about how much money you want to take in. Usually it will cost more than you think. So take in more money if you have the opportunity, especially given the workload that you have to put in to get that money. So a few little tips, there are thousands, but let's look at a few things that you can think about. The first monies that you take in externally, they are generally the most expensive. You wouldn't be uncommon to give up a third or more of your company in the very first external round. So try to, first of all, you've got your bootstrapping, but then when you do taking the first monies, it doesn't have to be real external money. It can be family and friends. It could be some loans perhaps from Almi. It could be your own capital. Your parents, anyone that you've got around you that can support you. Maybe some of the free advisors that you had helping you out in the beginning. Maybe they could go in with a little bit of money. They wouldn't be too fussed about the valuations. They're just happy to help out. So try to stretch that first stage as long as possible and reach as many milestones as you can before you take in the first money. Along with the planning do a roadmap with all your financing, so you at least have some sort of plan in place. Investors will want to see it too, but more for yourself. Make sure you know how much is it going to cost. Investors usually look at something called terminal value. So you look at, okay, here's the product today. If you reach all the way to the end, to success, this is what we think it'll be worth. And then they will sort of work backwards from there to get a valuation. And in that, they'll also be looking how much more money will you need along the way to get there. So have that plan for yourself. Know how much money it is you're going to need and when you think you're going to need it. And know which milestones, because it's the milestones that set the valuation targets. So make sure you're on top of that too. And look at all avenues of funding. So you've got the soft funding, maybe Vinova. You've got Almi with the loans or also investments with the other side of Almi. You've got the university, the incubators. You've got different grants. There's perhaps you could sell a proof of concept as a paid proof of concept to a customer, and the customer sees that there's enough value there. You could do co-development as well. So look at all forms of financing, not just the equity. And don't get stuck in a comfort zone. We also heard earlier, it's some of the ideas will fail, even though they were good ideas, because the entrepreneur wasn't willing to step out of their comfort zone. It could be heading out geographically. In some cases, it's just heading out of the university. You've been in university almost all your life. You're a PhD student. You're brilliant at what you do, but you've never been outside the university. You haven't presented to investors, and you're scared. And if that's the case, fine. As long as you can identify that flaw in your entire proposal, then just get help. Get people in that can help you with that. Because if you don't go out there, you will fail. And your product might be great in another market. It might be really good in another country or even another continent. And you need to be prepared to explore all those different avenues to make sure that you don't get stuck and leave yourself short. And you need to be flexible. So plans will absolutely change. You will have to pivot. You'll do things that don't work. You have to find a different way of doing it. So you always need to be flexible and be prepared for that when things don't go your way. And I guarantee you it will happen. And also be smart as well. So spend your money on the right things. Use the right people. And make sure you don't take, as I said before, any of these shortcuts that give you the short-term gain, but the long-term pain. And listen. One of the most frustrating things for us investors is when we get a feeling that entrepreneurs don't listen. They know best. They may well know best, but there's no reason not to listen. That doesn't mean you have to follow all the advice you get. Most of the advice you probably won't follow, but you need to listen, think about it, and then have a discussion with the person giving you the advice and say why you think that wouldn't be appropriate. And maybe together you will come up with something better. So, but make sure you listen. Don't be afraid to always listen and think about all the advice you get, but take everything with a grain of salt. And I did some leadership training many years ago, and one of the professors told me that a good leader doesn't do anything. So in other words, they delegate, they have control over everything that's happening, but they don't actually do anything themselves. So as soon as they go in and start messing up and doing things, then they lose the big picture, and then they're not doing their job as a good leader. Well, that doesn't quite work in the entrepreneur's world, unfortunately, because as an entrepreneur, you need to do everything. You'll be cleaning the toilet, and then you'll be working on some high-tech equipment the next day, and then you'll be speaking to investors, and you'll be doing some bookkeeping. You'll be doing everything. Make sure that you have all the bases covered in the beginning. So the things that you aren't good at, you need to get in help, but you will need to do a lot yourself in the beginning. And successfully, as things progress, as the company progresses, as it grows, as you take in more money, you will be able to delegate. And make sure that you've got that leadership, the traditional leadership role, as a goal at the end. So you actually are almost removing yourself from the company slowly over time. If you don't do that, then eventually the company will stop growing because of you. You'll be the actual thing stopping the company growing because you just don't have any more time or bandwidth. So keep that in mind. I'm just a few points. I assume that most of the listeners here are Swedish companies, and I want to say a few things about them, the Swedish perspective. And my colleagues can correct me later if they think I'm wrong. But first of all, Sweden is a fantastic place really to start a company because of the track record. Look at what we're actually per capita the second biggest exporter of the world of unicorn companies, and that's after Silicon Valley. So you have a really good basis for innovation here. If it's the Swedish way, if it's personality, if it's the school system, or a mix of everything, I don't know. But from that sense, you're in the right country. There is a very good support structure, in my opinion, at the early stage, at the universities and different incubators around. There's a lot of help you can get there to get off the ground. It's also, as Clementina said, really easy to start a company. You do it online, it takes you 10 minutes and you're up and running. There's also a much lower economic risk for yourself because you can, I've got a friend now starting a company who's being paid by a government agency because she was unemployed before. So now they're paying her to start her own company. You've got all sorts of various safety nets in place. You can get help with your housing. You can get all sorts of grants to help you. So in that sense, it takes away a bit of that risk. And I think that's probably the reason why more people actually do start companies, high-risk companies here, than they would in other countries. A lot of companies even allow their employees to take time off to try out their idea. And if it doesn't work, they can come back. You own your IP. Fantastic. I mean, that's a huge luxury to have. So you develop something at university, you own it, you can take it with you. I also find that the soft funding withers out a little bit after that first initial stage, and then Sweden becomes a little bit more of a difficult environment, say compared to even our neighbors in Norway or Denmark. You can get a lot more funding and grants, I find, in this sort of what we call the Death Valley phase. So keep that in mind as well. And lastly, I suppose it's a limited market, so the ticket sizes are generally smaller in Sweden. The valuations are also lower. Another reason to maybe think about your geographical confinements and your comfort zones, maybe it is a reason to head out earlier if your product or service is ready for it. And thank you very much.